Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. My name's Shannon Udy. I'm the program manager for our Good Health and Wellness program here at the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board. And thank you for joining our community health webinar series today. Um, Today, our webinar is Crafting Effective Surveys, Techniques, and Tips for Survey Success. And we're joined by Rachel Ng and Barbara Tan from Asset Inc. Rachel is the Senior Evaluation Specialist, and Barbara is a Data Coordinator. Without further ado, I think I will hand it over to Rachel and Barbara to get us started today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And thanks for everyone for joining today. Barbara, I'm wondering if you could share the slides. So we just wanted to thank Shannon and the rest of the Good Health and Wellness team for inviting us here today. And thank you everyone for joining us. So for our webinar, Crafting Effective Surveys, Techniques and Tips for Survey Success.
Are the slides shared or?
No.
Okay, let me reshare that. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I thought they were shared this whole time. Are we good?
We are good. Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you. And we can go to the next slide. So as Shannon said, my name is Rachel Ng. I'm a senior evaluation specialist, and I'm here with my colleague Barbara Tan, a data coordinator. And we also wanted to call out Garveen Goodplume, who is an evaluator at the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center. She provided valuable insight and inspiration for this webinar today. So Barbara and I work at Asset, and Asset collaborates with the Great Plains Good Health and Wellness program as its external evaluator for the Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country program. And as a company, Asset supports organizations as they imagine and create solutions to document and understand progress, more effectively deliver on goals, and plan for lasting impact. So we're really excited to be with you all today and talk about survey design. I'll hand it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for going over those introductions. I'm excited to be here with all of you, and thank you all for coming. Now we'd like to go over the plan for the next hour or so and review the objectives of this webinar together. So we hope that by the end of our time together, you'll be able to understand technical considerations for survey creation, identify characteristics of both good and bad surveys, develop effective survey questions, and plan for data collection. Overall, we hope that you will learn how to create technically sound surveys tailored to your program's goals and needs, leading to more impactful evaluation. And while these are the goals and objectives of this webinar, we also don't want you to walk out of here thinking that you have to follow all the strategies that we'll talk about today. You know your communities the best, and so you might already have strategies that work for you when it comes to designing and administering surveys, which is great. So feel free to take and use what you feel is right for you. Okay, so we finished introductions and now we'll jump into technical considerations, followed by developing survey questions, some survey examples, and considerations for data collection. If you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, like Shannon had mentioned, please put them in the chat and we'll try to address them at the end. All right, so jumping into technical considerations. When creating a survey, it's important to think about the following areas. Readability. Is the survey easy to read? Analysis friendly. Is the information provided by the survey easy to interpret and or analyze? And is it respondent friendly? Is it easy for respondents to complete the survey? So we're going to go ahead and dive deeper into each of these areas. So readability is important because for a survey to be readable, it ensures that respondents can navigate through the survey with ease and also to understand what is being asked, leading to more accurate and also reliable data collection. And the first two considerations for readability is to have a survey title and purpose. Clearly having both these elements will help respondents understand what the survey is about and also why their participation is important and needed. You want to keep the title and purpose as direct as possible, but also complete to avoid confusing and losing the attention of your respondents. Another thing you might want to consider is the font size. Is the font size appropriate? When thinking about this question, you might want to consider the methods or ways in which respondents will complete the survey. So, for example, if respondents are completing the survey on smaller screens, such as a phone, are the questions still readable? Similarly, think about the font itself. Handwritten or cursive fonts might not be as appropriate for a survey in comparison to Arial or other sans serif fonts. Furthermore, ensure that the directions are understandable. And so one common direction within surveys is to indicate whether respondents should select one or select all that apply for a question that has multiple response choices. Lastly, you want to ensure that concise and straightforward language is used to explain how respondents will answer the questions and also how they will move through the survey. Survey fatigue is very real, especially since the pandemic, and so a shorter survey will likely receive more responses and maintain the respondents' attention. All right, so the next area we'll discuss is analysis friendly. You now have all this data and need to analyze it. The analysis process can take a while, but there are a few things that could help reduce the time and burden of analysis. And one consideration is grouping the survey items by categories. And for example, you might ask all demographic questions such as race, ethnicity, age at the beginning of the survey. Then let's say your survey is aimed at understanding respondents' experience with the cooking class. You might put questions that ask about the logistics of the cooking class, such as experience with registration and location altogether. So in essence, by grouping the survey items, it will make it easier to assign sections of the survey to different people to analyze, as well as it helps you stay organized with the analysis. Another question you might ask when creating surveys is, are the response choices meaningful? So in other words, can you make meaning out of the responses? For example, staying on the topic of understanding the experiences in a cooking class, you ask a question in the survey about whether the cooking class can be improved. The response choices are yes and no, but there's no room for follow-up. These would not be meaningful response choices because there's no way to learn about in what specific ways the cooking class can be improved. Instead, you might consider opting to include an opportunity for respondents to either expand upon their answers, or you could list some ideas to improve the cooking class and ask respondents to provide feedback on those ideas. The last question here to consider, are there any double-barreled questions in the survey? You want to avoid asking questions that address more than one idea per item. And so, for example, there's the question, was the registration form for the cooking class easy to access and easy to navigate? This is considered a double-barreled question because easy to access and easy to navigate are two different things. And so a registration form may be easy to access, but it might not be easy to navigate, and vice versa. Overall, respondents may find it difficult to answer this question because it's asking about those two different things. So it'd be good to split that question into two separate ones. All right, and then the third and final area we'll discuss here is respondent-friendly. And the first item on our checklist here is to provide an appropriate amount of space for a response. You should anticipate whether the responses to a question will require respondents to elaborate, and if so, provide the space to do that. So again, for example, you would offer more room to respond to a question like, please explain how you will apply what you learned from the cooking class, as opposed to a question like, name one thing you liked about the cooking class. And so this consideration is particularly relevant for paper surveys. Respondents may not respond as in-depth as they would like to if there is not enough space. Also consider asking respondents to provide any final comments or questions, especially if it's a survey for feedback. You may capture some interesting and useful data by allowing respondents to write freely, as what they write may not have been addressed in the other survey questions that you asked. Other considerations here include the layout of the survey and accessibility, which we'll also talk a little bit more later on. Does the survey capture one's attention? Can respondents complete the survey online, on paper, both formats? Again, you know your community is the best, so what would make the most sense in terms of accessibility and layout? So now that we've gone through some technical considerations, let's talk about developing the survey questions. So firstly, you want to think about your evaluation question. What are you interested in understanding? For example, you might be interested in knowing about what the most impactful resource in your community has been. That's great. How can we go from that broad, overarching question to multiple survey questions? So once you know what you're interested in understanding, think about what ways you can capture that understanding. These are known as your indicators or your measures. Following a previous example of wanting to know the most impactful resource in your community, your indicators or measures could include the frequency of resource utilization, the community's perception of the resource, perceived benefits of the resource, etc. The question to ask is, how will you assess the identified indicators or measures? So if you want to capture the frequency of resource utilization, for example, one question you might ask respondents is, how often do you utilize that particular resource? If you want to capture the community's perception or experience with the resource, you might ask the respondent, how would you rate the effectiveness of that particular resource? So now let's talk a little bit more about these survey questions. So when it comes to developing survey questions, there are two general categories of questions, closed-ended and open-ended. We're going to start with closed-ended here. And so closed-ended questions include multiple choice, Likert scale or rating type questions, select one or all that apply questions, rankings, and drop-downs. Now, the pros of using closed-ended questions are one, efficiency. They are very fast to respond to and fast to analyze as well. And two, standardization. So this means that responses, can be compared across respondents since they all answer questions with the same options. And with standardization, you are also able to pull statistics from closed-ended questions, such as averages and ranges. And of course, closed-ended questions are pretty straightforward. The cons of using closed-ended questions, however, are firstly limited response options, which does lend itself to forced choice. And what we mean by this is respondents may end up selecting an option that doesn't quite align with their true opinion. And so closed-ended questions also don't encourage much exploration of a topic, since respondents cannot choose what to share and in how much detail, typically. So if you do choose to include closed-ended questions in your survey, you might want to consider the following. First, list all anticipated responses, otherwise provide an other option. You could also provide NA or unsure options where appropriate. Specifically, if you believe a question would not pertain to all the respondents, including NA would be appropriate in that case. And the NA or unsure also helps capture the most accurate data and could encourage respondents to complete the survey. Including these options, too, will also address the issue of forced choice as described earlier. And then you also want to avoid unclear qualifiers such as often and frequent, as respondents may interpret these qualifiers differently. So like, how often is often? like that could be interpreted differently across respondents. Other considerations are to avoid technical language, ensuring responses are balanced, especially if you are using a scale, and using skip logic where appropriate. So what we mean by balanced responses is including both negative and positive sentiments. So let's say the positive side of a scale is very, very likely and likely. You want to include on the opposite end, very unlikely and unlikely. And this is as opposed to a scale that reads only very, very likely, likely, and neutral. Because you don't have those negative sentiments, it doesn't make it fair for the respondents to only have those options. And I think I'll now pass it over to Rachel to talk about open-ended questions and share some survey examples.
Great, thanks, Barbara. So another type of survey question is the open-ended question. And these open-ended questions invite respondents to offer narrative responses. And usually what that looks like in a survey is a question with a box that's blank or with lines that are blank. So it depends on if it's a written survey or electronic, what that space might look like for people to write an open-ended response or a narrative response. Like the close-ended questions that Barbara just talked about, there are pros and cons to open-ended questions that you might want to consider when you decide if you want to include one or more open-ended question in your survey. So we'll start with the pros on the left. So some benefits of including open-ended questions are that they are exploratory. There's an opportunity for depth and richness of responses. And there's also more flexibility than close-ended questions. So around the exploratory aspect of pros of open-ended questions is that respondents have a lot of agency over how they answer an open-ended question. They have a choice of what they share and how much to share. So it's been my experience that this has led to me understanding things about respondents' feelings, experiences, beliefs, and attitudes that maybe I didn't anticipate learning because we offered this open-ended opportunity. So it allows for a more exploratory way to understand people's responses to those open-ended questions. And then with an open box or blank lines, respondents can share as much as they want to, and some will share maybe a word or two, and then others might share much more, depending on how much room there is and time to answer the question. So my hope when I include open-ended questions is that I gain a richer understanding of the respondents' experiences or feelings, and also gain a more nuanced or complex kind of understanding than I might with a closed-ended question. There also are some cons with considering when considering open-ended questions. So they tend to be less analysis friendly. And like Barbara mentioned with the close-ended questions, those can be really great because it is relatively simple to count like the number of specific responses and calculate percentages. With open-ended questions, that is a little bit more complex and usually more time-consuming. So it just tends to take more time to make sense of qualitative information. So subjectivity is also something to consider. everyone, when they analyze information, brings their own experiences and biases to that sense making. So sometimes at Asset, when we're making sense of narrative information, open-ended responses, we might have two people looking at the data, the same data, and coding it, essentially like what patterns are we seeing, and then talking to each other to see if there is similarities in how people are understanding that narrative response. So that's one way that we kind of try to address the biases that we all bring to making sense of information. That kind of analysis can take more time and resources to do. Another con is around quantifying. So with close-ended questions, as I mentioned, we can do counts or percentages. The percentage of respondents who answered strongly agree, for example. With open-ended questions, it's more difficult to do that quantifying. So if I'm trying to understand, what percentage of the people who attended the training gained new knowledge, and my goal is, say, 75% of training participants gain new knowledge, that would be probably easier to understand with close-ended question than with an open-ended question. And then finally, response fatigue, as Barbara has already mentioned. Response fatigue is real. And I know that for myself, often a list of items that I can choose an answer is easier than if I need to write a narrative response. I need to reflect on my feelings or experiences. Sometimes that's just, it takes more energy than checking a box with existing options. All right, so say you've weighed the pros and cons of including one or more open-ended questions, and you're set to include some in your survey. So here are a few things that you might want to consider when including one or more open-ended questions. Similar to close-ended questions, it's important to avoid leading language. So in this example, we have, please describe your experience with our engaging cooking classes. So that word engaging is leading. It assumes something about people's experiences already in the cooking classes, and then leading language can lead respondents to answer a certain way. So it's, we would recommend removing that word engaging in this sense. Another consideration is if you really want to gather open-ended information or narrative information, a survey, might not be the best method to do that, especially if you find yourself including many open-ended questions in a survey. So you could consider other data collection strategies like interviews or focus groups to gather this information. Something to consider with data collection in general is, how much resources it will take to gather the information, both resources from the data collector perspective and also the respondents, the time and energy that they're kind of gifting the experience. And often interviews and focus groups take more time and so more resources than a survey. And then finally, another consideration for open-ended questions is around enough space and time for people to really answer those open-ended questions. So with space, it could be the a big enough box or enough lines for someone to write a response, and then also time. It generally takes more time to answer those open-ended questions. So it's just important to be upfront at the beginning of the survey about those expectations. And then finally, some general tips for developing survey questions. And this is, around if you want to include closed-ended or open-ended questions, really prioritizing those survey items by what you need to know and what would be nice to know. So like we've talked about around survey fatigue, just considering the amount of time and energy that respondents are likely able to provide when they fill out this survey, and the information that's really important that you need to know. I like to put that at the beginning of the survey. For example, if I know that I need certain information to improve my programming, or if I need certain information because our funder is expecting that, I'll put those question items first. And then the questions that I still really want to know but aren't a priority, I would put at the latter part of the survey. So also, you might want to consider at the end of the survey to include those open-ended questions. And that's because of what we've talked about with the amount of time it might take for people to answer those questions. And we want to kind of do everything that we can to get as much kind of information from the survey as possible. And sometimes with the open-ended questions, someone might run out of time or have to go or gets tired, and they just, they end the survey. And so that's, with that priority questions up front, and then also those open-ended questions at the end can help kind of increase the likelihood that people will answer all the questions. Include difficult questions at the end. It's been my experience that I like to start a survey with some easier questions for the respondents to answer, and that kind of sets them up to be in the mindset to answer questions that might feel more difficult. So putting those difficult questions at the end can increase the likelihood that people are ready to answer those questions. And then finally, including an introduction to the survey that has the purpose of the survey. So why do we want to know this information? The expected time to complete the survey. Usually I put like a range of minutes, or if it's a really short survey, like less than 2 minutes or less than 5 minutes, just as a way to really be as transparent as possible for the respondent to know what they're getting into and their time commitment. If there's a response deadline, I put that in the introduction as well. That might not be applicable if I'm doing a survey, like a feedback survey in person at an event. Like I want people to fill that survey out right away. But if I have an electronic survey that might be open for 2 weeks, I'll include that deadline in the intro. I'll also include if participation is anonymous. So just being transparent about if I'm collecting any information about people that could potentially tie them to their responses, I want to be really upfront about that. And then incentive information. It's been our experience that depending on the context, incentives can really increase participation rates, and also is a way to honor respondents' time, energy, experience. So I like to include information about incentives in the introduction. So then the next part of our webinar, we made up some example survey questions, and there are 3 of them. And so we're going to go through and describe what the original question is and then how we might revise it using some of the tips and strategies that we've talked about so far. So this example survey question is, did this event provide you new knowledge about traditional tobacco, and would you like to participate in more events like this one? All right, and then here is on the left, we still have that original. And then this is how we might revise it using some of the techniques. Did this event provide you new knowledge about traditional tobacco, and would you like to participate in more events like this one? So this is, an example of what Barbara shared earlier, a double-barreled question. So this original question asks about 2 things. It asks if the respondents gain knowledge, and then if they would participate in more events like this one. So splitting up that question into 2 not only helps the respondent answer the question because we are more clear about what we want to learn, it also then helps on the analysis side because we have a more clear understanding of people's experiences and desires for the future. So if we had that original question and someone responded yes, we wouldn't know if they were responding yes to both of those parts of the question or just one or the other. It would be really hard to understand. And I mean, one thing that we really try to kind of focus on when we create a survey is what will result in like a good experience for the respondent, and then also result in information that we can make sense of. All right. So, and I wonder if we could try a little like engagement in the chat. I know people can chat. If you're able to chat, I would invite you in the chat to just reflect on how you might change this question. So this question is, how did you hear about the event? And it has an open-ended, this is an example of an open-ended question. And I'm curious if anyone has an idea of how they might revise this to have more meaningful information. So I see, thank you, Margaret. I see you in the chat. Provide options, including other, with comments. Yeah, thank you. Great. Thanks, Brady. Yeah, similar idea there. Great. A drop-down menu with options. Yes. Great. Thanks, Barbara. So we were all kind of like on the same wavelength here. Wonderful. So yeah, this is an idea of how we might revise this question. So in instances where there might be a finite number of answer options or answer options that would likely be more frequent than others, you could have a list like this, and like the folks in the chat noted too. So how we revised it here is, how did you hear about the event, and select all that apply, because someone might have heard about it from a friend and heard about it on the radio, for example. And so if I want to understand kind of the breadth of ways that people heard about the event, it would be important for me to do that, select all that apply. And probably someone didn't hear about this event through all of these, so they probably wouldn't select all of them. I think that's sometimes a risk when saying select all that apply. Someone could select all of them, and then that makes analysis a bit more tricky, but I think in this situation, that select all that apply could be beneficial. And then, as some people noted in the chat, we also have that other option as the last one, with that narrative option to write in another way they might have heard of it, because this is an example of a question that, although we tried to think of some of the more frequent ways that someone could hear about an event, there are other ways that we might not have thought of. So having that other just makes it so that people can write in another option. All right, I think, great. So I think if anyone wants to put in the chat how they might revise this, we'd love to hear it. Our original is, on a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate the training? And then we have a blank line for people to put an answer. So any ideas of how you might revise this to gain more meaningful information? All right. Awesome. I see a few answers here. So give them an actual scale from 1 to 10. And then have more of like a Likert scale, maybe like dislike to like. Yeah, great. Explain what 0 means and 10 means. Clarify what 1 and 10 represent. Yes. Scale. Great. Awesome. And you know what? I would now change, yeah, I would change maybe what we put in this revise based on the answers in the chat. So I think thank you everyone for engaging. It also is a kind of example for me that there are usually many ways to ask a question. So like Barbara said at the beginning, really leaning into what you know about your community and who you imagine will be answering these questions. We just really invite you to do that when you design your surveys. So the way that we revised it, and there are other ways too, are we kind of made it more explicit about what we were looking to learn. So one way to revise this is to ask, or to have a statement, the materials covered in the training will be helpful for me. And then the presenter presented the materials in an engaging way. So we revised it this way, but there are other ways to do it too. Like, if we wanted to keep that scale option, I really like that idea of clarifying what the 1 means. On a scale from 1, that means not good, to 10, that means great. Like, how would you rate it? And then maybe have that scale, as someone said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've found that sometimes with a 1 to 10, and having a blank, someone might write like 7.5, and that's it requires a decision on the person and analyzing the data, like, okay, how do I treat that 0.5? Do I round it up to 8? And then we've yeah, like a couple people said in the chat, like maybe a 6 could mean something for one person and it could mean something else for another. So having those yes, somewhat, and no as a specific answer option can help me understand what people might be responding to. Barbara, anything else you wanted to? Oh, great. Yeah, moving on. Thank you.
That was great, Rachel. Thank you. Thank you for going over those examples. Yeah, so now we just want to conclude today's webinar by providing some considerations for data collection. And these considerations may be useful for when you're developing the survey, but also after during the analysis phase. And so first of all, consider your audience. And this is something we've reiterated multiple times throughout this presentation. Who will participate in the survey? In what ways will this influence the questions that you ask? And in what ways will this influence the way you administer the survey? And so we've already mentioned how important it is that your survey is readable and also accessible by your respondents. You know your community the best. And so speaking of accessibility, we'd also like to reiterate some questions and points that we made earlier. And so you might want to ask yourself, is the survey administered online, paper, phone? What makes the most sense for your potential survey respondents? Or if a particular format doesn't work, are there other alternative formats available? And then also language, like is the survey available in different languages? And if not, are there interpreters available to support respondents in completing the survey? So overall, accessibility is just a huge component to data collection. And if respondents can't or don't have access to the survey, then obviously you won't be able to collect the information that you need, or you might not even be able to get the most accurate and reliable data that you need. So next consideration is the time frame. When will you administer the survey? For example, I know the 4th of July is coming up, so you might want to avoid administering the survey when you know respondents are busy, such as during a holiday week like that. And you might want to also ask yourself, like, how long you will give respondents to answer the survey. Like if you do decide to administer the survey during a holiday week or some other busy time, let's say, again, the 4th of July, you might want to give respondents a few extra days in anticipation. And then the time it takes to analyze responses, or if there's a deadline for reporting or other important things to consider. Overall, you just want to make sure that there's enough time to develop the survey, administer the survey, analyze the survey, and incorporate the survey responses if needed into a report. The next consideration is response rate. So now that you've put in all this work to create the survey, how many responses do you want to receive? And it's important to be reasonable, as this number can change depending on what you want to understand. So in other words, if the survey is used to understand the experiences of participants, again, in a cooking class, and the cooking class had 25 participants, then you can only collect so many responses. On the other hand, if a survey is administered to community members at a festival, then the number of responses would likely be larger. And if you don't reach the goal number of responses, what do you plan to do? What are some next steps that you can take? I know Rachel had mentioned like incentives can be important and might help to gather or encourage respondents to answer the survey. And that was the end of our content for the webinar. Thank you for coming today. And if you have any questions, we're open to hearing them.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Rachel, for that wonderful presentation. Yes, please feel free to type any questions in the chat or use the Q&A feature. Again, if you have a more lengthy question or would like to discuss a little more, you can raise your hand and I would be happy to unmute you. I did see a question earlier in the chat that was asking what is the longest a survey can or should be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really depends on the context and what you hope to learn from the survey. So like the example that Barbara just gave about, a festival. Say I'm wanting to do a survey to understand who's at a festival, and there's a lot going on in the festival. I might want to have a shorter survey because I know people will want to do like a lot of things at the festival. And or like if I want to learn more about festival attendees, maybe I have a longer survey, but I know I won't get as many responses if it's a longer survey. So it's kind of like weighing the different options and what you value. Sometimes if it depends on who is answering the survey, like if they're answering it as part of like their job, we might create a longer survey in that situation. And then Barbara, anything that you wanted to add on that question based on your experience?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. And also, just if it is a longer survey, you might want to consider having that incentive again. I feel like, if possible, incentives really do encourage participants, even like in that festival setting. Like maybe people will be attracted to come to talk to you because you have like candy at your booth or something. Um, but I've also just noticed, like, I guess generally speaking, like on feedback forms and things like that about like a particular event, the sweet spot is kind of about that 10 to 15 minutes or less, like even 5 minutes. But I have had surveys that are an hour. And like Rachel had mentioned, if it's part of their job, then they might be more inclined to fill out those longer surveys that are about 45 minutes, hour length.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but I was curious if you both had any recommendations for um, easy to use like survey creation platforms that people can use, especially if they're like sending them out virtually in an email, that type of thing. If there's some nice go-tos that you guys recommend.
For us, the first thing that comes to mind is Smartsheet. And so Smartsheet is this platform where you can create surveys that are linked to spreadsheets as well. So when you create a Smartsheet survey and respondents fill in the answers automatically appear within the spreadsheet that the survey is linked to. And some other features with Smartsheet is that you can easily share it with other people. Like if you're collaborating with somebody else to create the survey, you can share it with them. There's also like survey logic. And so if you only want like certain people to answer specific questions, you can have it that way. And yeah, and then Google Forms, I mean, like it's open to everyone. It's public, it's free, pretty easy to use as well. Rachel, do you have any other things you want to add?
No, I think, yeah, the kind of depending on the resources that are available, like Google Forms is a great free resource. I know we use other data collection tools like in meetings, so like a Mentimeter to gain quick kind of feedback is also an option.
Wonderful. Thank you. I do see a question in the chat on how do you analyze and evaluate open-ended questions in surveys, ones that aren't necessarily measurable?
Great question. Yes. There are a couple ways to do it. One way that I've done it before is that maybe I know that I'm looking for some patterns. I know that there are like 3 or 4 kind of ideas that I'm looking for when I'm analyzing quantitative information. I might have those 4 things like highlighted in different colors, like in one document, and then I would highlight as I read the responses, I would highlight those responses that would match kind of a theme that I'm already looking for. So with the cooking class, and I want to understand kind of people's experiences at a cooking class. Maybe I know from my past experiences that people really enjoy like cooking with other people, like being in community. They like learning new things. They like learning about their culture. So I know that that's what I've heard before. So maybe I would start with those themes and then look for that in the data. Another way to do it is I don't have any kind of preconceived ideas of what I'm looking for. So then I might read through the answers and just kind of notice, am I reading things that are similar to each other? And then, oh, how might I describe that in 1 or 2 words? And so that's more of kind of a iterative theming or coding, looking for patterns as I go. So it's more of an art, I would say. Barbara, how would you describe your process of analyzing open-ended question data?
Yeah, I think for me, it's very common to create those themes, like Rachel said. And also, like, once you have the themes from the responses, possibly including like a representative quote, like maybe one of the responses from someone like had something that you feel is important for the client to know, and like you don't want to miss that, or like I guess reword it in a way that is no longer what the respondent meant. So you can just include the quote as is, make it stand out. And just like, it's really like storytelling. I just want to say, like, that's kind of my approach to things. So after analyzing the responses, just what story are you going to tell? And then I know that you can also get creative like visually too. So with open responses, you can maybe create like a word cloud. I don't know, just some ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel and Barbara. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. I know we're almost to the top of the hour. But now that we've just listened to this wonderful presentation about surveys, I've entered a link into the chat to our feedback survey, which we would all appreciate you to complete if you have time, to help us with any future webinars that we will host. I know there's been questions about the follow-up email and slides and the recording. We should have the recording follow-up email out tomorrow, as well as a copy of the slides. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. Everyone who attended or registered will be getting that email. So with that, I think we will go ahead and end. Just another big thank you to our presenters, Rachel and Barbara. We really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you everyone for hopping on and participating in our webinar. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.